when we're talking about the emergency order aspect of this, right? She's using this emergency order as the basis for issuing this suspension of gun carry rights. And she's arguing that gun violence has become such a significant problem in Albuquerque and the surrounding county that she needed to take bold action. But when you look at the actual crime rate there, you look at statistics from the Albuquerque Police Department, murder is actually down significantly from the previous year. Through June, they've seen a 21% decrease compared to the previous period in 2022. So how does that stack up when you're going to consider these legal arguments in the case? Does that matter at all? Does it, like, the fact that it seems to be perhaps based on very shaky grounds in terms of whether there even is an emergency at play, or does that even not come into to the argument in this case?
Yeah, it shouldn't matter. If we go all the way back to Heller said the test in Second Amendment cases was text as informed by the nation's history and tradition. And then what you had happen for, I don't know, what was it, 13, 14 years, courts went, yeah, that's great. We're gonna apply this different test where it was a means and scrutiny test where they looked at the government interest and what the stuff behind it was, and they landed on intermediate scrutiny almost always. It was almost never strict scrutiny, which was the highest tier that the government would have to clear in order to justify its ban or restriction. Under that old test, those statistics would have been relevant because the governor could say, well, look, there is a crime issue, and because crimes are being committed with firearms and there's a high likelihood of either serious bodily injury or death, that's the basis for this restriction, and it's justified because the government has a compelling or a very vested interest in keeping its population safe. Bruin reiterated what was said in Heller. No, the test is the text of the Second Amendment as informed by the nation's history and tradition. And if you look at the language in Bruin, it goes on to say that when there were problems that existed in society that have transcended, the generations, this is not a new problem. Look, put another way, people committing crime with firearms is not novel to the 21st century. It's something that existed at the time of the founding and all the way through. And when there weren't these restrictions throughout history, particularly at the time of the founding, which is the relevant time period to look at, it's essentially that they considered this and they said the Second Amendment protects this kind of conduct, and these restrictions are not something that are constitutionally permissible. So all that to say, her using crime as a justification, it doesn't fly for any number of reasons, including that's not the test we use today. And even if it was the test, if you were to look at the statistics, it doesn't support the proposition that she's offering it for anyway.
Okay, so sort of regardless of whether or not crime is on the rise, or you can make if she'd been in a better position to make this argument that there's an emergency, none of that really matters in your view as far as whether this is a constitutional action for her to take, just because essentially any attempt to suspend carry rights for any reason is going to be a violation of the Second Amendment. Is that the basic idea?
That's the basic idea, without delving too far into the weeds as to, are there some historical bases where it may have been permissible? If you want to talk about emergency powers and wartime stuff, were certain populations disarmed? Yeah, but that's really digging into the weeds. I think as a general premise, your summation of it is correct.
Yeah, and I actually maybe get into those weeds a little bit, because there is some tradition, I suppose, of disarming, populations that during the founding that were, for instance, people who didn't take loyalty oaths were often disarmed during the founding. But that's not going to be historically analogous to just disarming everybody in Albuquerque, right? I guess is the argument.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly right. So, part of what also Bruin had said was that those restrictions, if they're not a dead ringer, and, a lot of them are not going to necessarily be based on changes in society for some things, that they do need to be historically analogous. And it needs to not be so far removed. So, for example, when you're restricting carry in parks, you can't necessarily rely on laws that restricted carry on somebody's land for the purposes of to prevent poaching. And if you look at a lot of these cases, the historical laws that are being cited, the proposition they're being cited for, you can't extrapolate it and apply it in a logical manner without really doing some mental gymnastics just to say, well, we want to ban carry here or we want to ban this thing here. So when you look at history, there were certain groups that were disarmed, particularly at the time of the founding, those who were deemed loyal to the crown. They were a threat, and it was more so in the sense of an insurrection than anything else. Not that they were going out committing crime, but it was an insurrection, potential insurrectionists against the government. So there were a few populations, and actually one of my former colleagues, Joe Greenlee, has written extensively about this. And if I encourage any of your listeners, if they're all interested, he's written some very detailed things about these types of people that were prohibited in the past and bars on these kinds of things. But he really gets into the specific subset of groups that at some point in time were disarmed and the reason behind why they were disarmed. But to bring it all home, those restrictions on who are not historically analogous to just banning carry for everybody by the city or in this county.